Welcome. Tonight we are going north, not to the shore of the north, not to the coasts where the tundra meets the sea, and the polar bears walk the ice edge, and the seabirds gather in their millions on the cliff faces in summer. We are going further. We are going past the coasts and past the continental shelves and past the last island and into the center, into the deep ocean that sits beneath the Arctic ice cap, beneath the frozen surface of the world's smallest and shallowest ocean, the ocean that no one thinks about, because the ice covers it, and the ice makes it invisible, and the cold makes it seem empty. We are going to the Arctic Ocean, to the water beneath the ice, to the world that exists in the dark and the cold and the pressure beneath a ceiling of frozen seawater that has been there, in some form, for at least 2.5 million years. Find your position now. Let the surface beneath you hold your weight the way the ice holds its own weight above the Arctic Ocean, completely, without effort, without complaint. Your breathing is slowing. The warmth of the room is settling into your body. There is nothing required of you tonight except to be here in the quiet, and to let the north come to you, because the north will come if you are still enough. The Arctic Ocean is not far, in the way that the universe is not far. It is always there at the top of the world, a body of water that covers 14 million square kilometers, and that reaches depths of more than 5,000 meters, and that is, in its deepest and coldest and least visited parts, as unknown to science as the surface of Mars. It is the most poorly understood ocean on Earth. It is the one we know least about, and it is, tonight, exactly where we are going. Let the number settle. 14 million square kilometers of ocean, covered for most of the year by ice that ranges in thickness from a few centimeters of new ice in autumn to more than 4 meters of old multi-year ice that has survived summer after summer without melting. Ice that was frozen seawater, and that carries in it the record of the seasons in rings and layers, the way a tree carries its rings, each one a year, each year readable in the chemistry of the ice if you know how to read it. The Arctic ice is a library of years, and beneath it, the ocean is a library of something older, something that the ice preserves without knowing what it is preserving, the cold, dark water that has been circulating in the basin of the Arctic for millions of years, older than the ice above it, older than most of what we think of as the Arctic landscape, older than the current configuration of the continents in the north. The Arctic Ocean has a shape that most people have never seen. On the maps that hang in schoolrooms and decorate the walls of offices and fill the pages of atlases, the Arctic is usually compressed or cut off, the flat projection of the globe unable to show the top of the world without distortion or omission. Look at a globe from directly above the North Pole, and the Arctic Ocean comes into view as what it is, a roughly circular basin surrounded by land, by the northern coasts of Russia and Canada and Alaska and Greenland and Norway, with fingers and arms reaching into the surrounding landmasses in the great gulfs and seas that are technically part of the Arctic, or its margins, the Barents Sea and the Kara Sea, and the Laptov Sea and the East Siberian Sea on the Russian side, the Beaufort Sea, and the Canadian Arctic Archipelago on the North American side, the Greenland Sea on the Atlantic margin. It is a surrounded ocean, the most landlocked of all the oceans, connected to the Pacific through the shallow and narrow Bering Strait, and connected to the Atlantic through the deeper passages between Greenland and Norway and Iceland, and these connections matter enormously for the ecology of the water inside, because they determine what comes in and what goes out. What water masses enter the Arctic basin from the warmer oceans to the south, and what Arctic water leaves to modify the temperature and salinity of those warmer oceans in return. The water beneath the ice is not uniformly cold. This is the first thing to understand about the Arctic Ocean, the thing that surprises people who assume that beneath a frozen surface there can only be frozen water. The surface layer of the Arctic Ocean, the top 50 to 100 meters, is cold and relatively fresh. Fresh because the melting of sea ice in summer releases fresh water into the upper layer, and because the great rivers of Siberia and Canada pour enormous quantities of fresh water into the Arctic every summer, diluting the salt water near the surface to a salinity that is significantly lower than the open ocean average. This cold, fresh layer sits on top of a layer of warmer, saltier water that has come in from the Atlantic, carried north by the currents that connect the Arctic to the Atlantic Ocean. Water that is warmer than the surface layer by several degrees, warmer than the freezing point of seawater by enough to sustain complex biological communities, but trapped below the cold, fresh surface layer by the density difference between the two water masses, warm and salty below, cold and fresh above. A stratification so stable that the two layers mix very slowly, and the heat in the Atlantic layer is effectively imprisoned at depth, unavailable to warm the surface or melt the ice from below. Or was, until recently. But we will come to that. Close your eyes now or let them soften. We are going down through the ice, through the brine channels in the ice that are themselves a world, down through the cold surface water and into the deeper layers, into the Atlantic layer with its few degrees of warmth in an ocean that has no other warmth, and below that into the deep Arctic water that fills the bottom of the basin, the coldest and densest and oldest water in the ocean. Water that has been down here in some cases for hundreds of years, moving in the slow thermohaline circulation of the global ocean at speeds that make glaciers look rushed. We are in the Arctic Ocean tonight. The ice is above us, the bottom is below us, and between, in the dark water, in the cold that is absolute and permanent and ancient, there is life. More life than you would expect. More life, perhaps, than you would believe. The ice itself is alive. This is the beginning of the Arctic Ocean's biological story. Not in the water beneath the ice, but in the ice itself. In the brine channels and pockets that thread through the sea ice, like a complex network of miniature caves and corridors, each one filled with brine that is colder and saltier than seawater, and that is, improbably, inhabited. The organisms that live in the brine channels of sea ice are among the most extreme extremophiles in the ocean, life pushed into conditions so far outside what most biology can tolerate that their existence reads like a proof of principle rather than a natural occurrence, a demonstration that life will find a way into every space the physical world provides, no matter how cold, how salty, how dark. The brine channel communities include bacteria, the ice algae that color the underside of the Arctic ice a golden brown in spring, and that are the foundation of the entire Arctic food web, the microscopic single-celled organisms that form the base of the Arctic food chain in the same way that phytoplankton form the base of the open ocean food chain, but in a radically different and radically more extreme setting, frozen into the ice rather than floating in the sunlit water below. The ice algae bloom in spring. When the sun returns to the Arctic after the months of polar night, the light that penetrates the ice is filtered and diffused and reduced to a fraction of what reaches the open ocean surface, but it is enough. The ice algae, adapted to extreme cold and low light through millions of years of evolution in the ice, begin to photosynthesize, converting the dim, filtered light and the carbon dioxide dissolved in the brine into organic carbon, the currency of all biological production. The bloom moves downward through the ice as the spring progresses, tracking the light, and when the underside of the ice becomes thin enough and the melt begins and the algae cells are released into the water below the ice, a cascade begins. The algae fall through the water column in clouds of golden particles, and the animals that have been waiting through the dark winter for exactly this begin to feed. The copepods, the tiny crustaceans that are the dominant zooplankton of the Arctic Ocean, rise from depth where they have spent the winter in a state of dormancy, their metabolic rate slowed to almost nothing. Their fat reserves accumulated in autumn, slowly sustaining them through the long dark, and they ascend into the algae bloom, and they eat voraciously, building the fat reserves that will in turn sustain the fish and the seabirds and the seals and the whales that eat them. The Arctic food web runs on ice algae, the whole thing. The polar cod and the ringed seal and the narwhal and the polar bear, all of them tracing their energy back to the single-celled organisms frozen into the brine channels of the sea ice, producing organic carbon in the cold and the dim light of the Arctic spring. The Arctic cod, Boreogadus saida, the keystone species of the Arctic Ocean, the animal that connects the planktonic world to the world of marine mammals and seabirds, the fish that everything in the Arctic eats. The Arctic cod is a small fish, rarely more than 30 centimeters long, cold water adapted to a degree that is extraordinary, even by the standards of polar marine biology. It produces anti-freeze proteins in its blood, compounds that bind to ice crystals as they form and prevent them from growing, preventing the freezing of the blood plasma at temperatures below the normal freezing point of water, allowing the fish to swim in water that is at or below the freezing point of fresh water without its blood turning to ice. The antifreeze proteins are one of those evolutionary solutions that, once you understand the problem they are solving, appear as obvious as any great engineering insight. And like all great engineering insights, they were arrived at independently by multiple lineages. The same solution evolved separately in Antarctic fish. In Arctic fish, in frogs and insects that live in frozen environments on land, each lineage arriving at the same answer to the same problem through different molecular pathways, a convergence that speaks to the power of the selective pressure when the alternative to the solution is death by freezing. The Arctic cod forms enormous aggregations beneath the sea ice, schools so dense that they appear on sonar as solid objects, clouds of fish moving in the water column under the ice, in formations that can extend for kilometers in every direction. The schools are not random. They are structured by the distribution of their prey, the copepods and amphipods and other small crustaceans of the under-ice community, and by the distribution of their predators, the ringed seals and bearded seals and beluga whales and narwhals that hunt them from below, and the guillemots and murreys that dive through the ice-free patches to hunt them from above. The Arctic cod exists at the center of a predator-prey web so tight and so interconnected that a change in the cod population propagates in every direction at once, up to the predators that depend on it and down to the prey populations that its grazing controls. The cod is the hinge of the Arctic ecosystem, the species that, if removed or significantly altered, changes everything that depends on it. The ringed seal, Pusa hispida, the most abundant seal in the Arctic, the primary prey of the polar bear, the most ice-associated of all the pinnipeds, an animal whose life is so completely built around sea ice that the prospect of significant sea ice loss in the Arctic in the coming decades is, for the ringed seal, an existential threat rather than a habitat modification. The ringed seal is small for a seal, perhaps 60 kilograms in adults, with a coat of silver-gray, marked with the rings of darker pigment that give it its name, rings that are the remnants of spots that the pups have in the first weeks of life, and that persist as rings in the adult coat, a developmental artifact that has no obvious function, but that makes the ringed seal recognizable at a distance. The ringed seal maintains breathing holes in the ice throughout the Arctic winter, keeping them open through the months when the ice is forming and thickening by using the claws on its front flippers to scrape the freezing surface clear, creating and maintaining a network of breathing holes across its territory that allows it to remain under the ice in the water where the cold is less extreme than the air temperatures above, hunting the Arctic cod and the amphipods and the small fish and crustaceans of the under-ice community. The ringed seal gives birth in a snow lair. The female excavates a small chamber in a snowdrift on the ice surface above a breathing hole, a chamber large enough to contain the pup and insulated by the snow from the extreme cold of the Arctic winter, and she gives birth there, in the snow, in the dark, in temperatures that may be -30 or -40 Celsius in the air outside the lair, while the interior of the lair, warmed by the female's body heat and insulated by the snow, remains near freezing. The pup is born white, the same white as the snow, a camouflage that has been selected for over millions of years of predation by polar bears and Arctic foxes that hunt for pups on the ice surface, and it remains white through the first weeks of life while it is nursing, putting on weight at a rate that turns its initial 20% body fat to 60% body fat in less than 2 months, becoming, in the language of the seal biologist, a fat ball, a pup so loaded with energy reserves that it is ready to survive the transition from nursing to independent life in the cold Arctic water. The white coat is shed at the end of nursing, and the pup enters the water for the first time in a grey-spotted juvenile coat, never having been in water before, never having caught a fish before, and yet able to swim and to dive, and to hunt with the competence of an animal for whom these things are natural, because they are natural, encoded in the genome, ready to deploy from the first moment the cold water receives the first-time swimmer. The polar bear, Ursus maritimus, the apex predator of the Arctic Ocean surface, the animal that most people think of when they think of the Arctic, the large white bear that has become the symbol of climate change in a way that no other animal has, the image used on magazine covers and in documentary films to represent what is being lost as the Arctic warms and the ice retreats. The polar bear is not, strictly speaking, a marine mammal, because it is a bear rather than a cetacean or a pinniped, and it breathes air in the same way all bears breathe air, and it reproduces on land or on the ice surface rather than in the water. But it spends more of its life on or in the ocean than most animals we would call marine mammals. It swims for hundreds of kilometers across open water between ice floes. It feeds almost exclusively on the ringed seals and bearded seals and other marine mammals of the Arctic Ocean. Its fur is adapted for insulation in water as well as air. Its feet are partially webbed, and its entire existence, its territory, its food supply, its ability to reproduce successfully, its population dynamics, are determined by the condition of the sea ice, which is the platform on which it hunts and the surface on which its females den and give birth. The polar bear hunts at the breathing holes of ringed seals using a technique called still hunting. Sitting motionless at a seal's breathing hole in the ice, sometimes for hours, in temperatures that would kill a human being in minutes, waiting with a patience that is itself a biological adaptation, the ability to remain inactive for extended periods while maintaining the sensory alertness and the muscular readiness to strike. When the seal surfaces to breathe, the polar bear has approximately a third of a second to strike, to reach into the hole with its massive forepaw and hook the seal and drag it onto the ice before it can dive again. The strike is one of the fastest movements of any large carnivore, and its success rate when executed by an experienced adult polar bear is high enough to sustain the bear's energy budget through the demanding physics of surviving in the Arctic winter. The polar bear is a hunting machine built from the same raw material as the brown bear, its ancestor, modified by perhaps 100,000 years of natural selection in the Arctic, into an animal that is optimized for this specific environment, in this specific niche, in a way that makes it one of the most successful large predators in the Arctic ecosystem, and one of the most vulnerable to the specific kind of change that the Arctic is currently undergoing. Let your breathing slow a little more now. The Arctic is cold and dark, and the ice above is pressing down on the water column, and the water is moving in its ancient thermohaline patterns, the cold, dense water sinking toward the bottom of the basin, the warmer Atlantic water intruding at depth, the surface layer turning over in its seasonal cycle of freeze and melt and freeze again. The polar bear is somewhere on the ice above, sitting at a breathing hole with the patience of an animal that has no alternative to patience. The ringed seal is below the ice, in the water, conserving heat with its thick layer of blubber, hunting the cod that are hunting the copepods that are eating the ice algae, that are converting the dim Arctic sunlight into the organic carbon that everything here runs on. The whole system is ticking over in the cold dark, as it has been ticking over for millions of years, each element dependent on all the others, each one the product of millions of years of co-evolution in conditions that select mercilessly for the efficient and the patient and the cold adapted. The narwhal. Monodon monoceros. We have met the narwhal before, in other waters, in other conversations about the ocean. But the narwhal belongs to the Arctic Ocean in a way that it belongs to nowhere else, because the narwhal is the most ice-associated of all the cetaceans, more so even than the bowhead, the whale, that is the narwhal's constant companion in the high Arctic and the animal with which it often shares its feeding grounds. The narwhal spends the winter in the heavy pack ice of Baffin Bay and the Davis Strait, in conditions that would make breathing difficult or impossible for any other cetacean, navigating through leads and cracks and breathing holes that it maintains through the ice the way the ringed seal maintains its breathing holes. Returning to the same cracks and openings repeatedly, its tusk, that extraordinary spiral tooth, perhaps also serving as an ice probe, a tool for testing the thickness of ice above a potential breathing hole, for sensing through vibration the structural integrity of the ice surface. The narwhal in heavy pack ice is doing something that no other large cetacean can do, occupying the most extreme winter habitat in the Arctic Ocean, beneath several meters of ice in water that is at the freezing point of seawater, and it is surviving there through a combination of physiological adaptation and behavioral flexibility that science is still in the process of fully characterizing. The narwhal's summer. The contrast is total. In summer, the narwhal moves to the open bays and fjords of the Canadian Arctic and northern Greenland, to the relatively ice-free water of the high summer Arctic. And in these summer aggregations, the narwhals gather in groups that can number in the thousands. Their tusks visible from the surface, the clicking and whistling of their communication audible through the hull of a small boat. The surface of the water broken continuously by the upward arcing of tusks as the animals breathe and socialize and dive for the fish and squid and halibut that form their summer diet. The summer aggregation of narwhals is one of the wildlife spectacles of the Arctic, seen by very few people, because the places where it occurs are remote, and the boats that can reach them are few, and the logistics of the high Arctic are demanding. But it exists. Every summer in the same bays and the same fjords the narwhals gather. They have been gathering there since before any human observed them. They will gather there as long as the bays and fjords remain accessible in summer and frozen enough in winter to provide the pack ice habitat they require for the cold months. The bowhead whale in the Arctic, Balaena mysticetus. We have spent time with the bowhead in other conversations, but the bowhead in its Arctic context deserves attention here because the Arctic Ocean is not simply the bowhead's habitat, it is the bowhead's world. The bowhead spends its entire life in the Arctic and subarctic, moving between the different marginal seas and the main Arctic basin with the seasons, following the ice edge as it advances and retreats, feeding in the productive waters where the ice creates the mixing and upwelling that concentrates its copepod prey, and doing all of this over a lifespan that can exceed 200 years, accumulating in those 2 centuries a knowledge of the Arctic that is, in its depth and its specificity, unmatched by any other organism in the system. The bowhead's head is its signature. Nearly a third of the total body length, massive and rounded. An instrument designed for breaking ice for the specific task of the bowhead that no other whale performs. The ability to surface through ice up to 60 centimeters thick by simply pushing upward with the rostrum. The enormous domed head forcing the ice aside or cracking it with the weight of the whale behind it. The bowhead has been observed breaking through ice to breathe at sites that would be inaccessible to any other cetacean, demonstrating an ability to exploit ice-covered feeding grounds that gives it access to the richest and most productive waters in the Arctic at the times of year when they are most productive, the spring and early summer, when the ice is thinning and the algae bloom is producing the dense concentrations of copepods that the bowhead feeds on. The bowhead is the only baleen whale that is truly Arctic, that has stayed in the ice rather than retreating to temperate or tropical waters for winter, as the other large baleen whales do. The Arctic is not the bowhead's summer destination. The Arctic is the bowhead's home. The ice is not an obstacle. The ice is the bowhead's ceiling, the surface it presses against to breathe, the cover it hunts beneath, the environment it has been navigating for longer than almost anything else alive on this planet. The walrus, Odobenus rosmarus, the tusked pinniped of the Arctic, the animal with the most immediately recognizable profile in the Arctic fauna, the massive body and the long ivory tusks that are used for hauling out onto ice, for dominance displays, for fighting, and almost certainly for a range of social functions that we have not yet fully documented. The walrus is a bottom feeder, diving to the seafloor of the shallow Arctic continental shelves to vacuum up the benthic invertebrates, primarily bivalves and other mollusks, that constitute the bulk of its diet. A large walrus can eat thousands of clams in a single foraging dive, using its muscular lips and its highly sensitive vibrissae, the bristling mustache of stiff sensory whiskers, to find and extract the clams from the sediment in the dark, murky water near the bottom without being able to see them. The vibrissae of the walrus are among the most sensitive mechanoreceptors in the marine mammal world, able to detect the slight depression in the sediment that marks the presence of a buried clam, and the minute vibrations of a moving invertebrate in the dark at close range. A precision of touch in an animal as large as a medium-sized car that speaks to the refinement that evolution achieves when the selective pressure is strong enough. The walrus haul-out, the gathering of walrus on ice floes and rocky beaches in summer and autumn, aggregations that can include thousands of animals in close body contact, the smell and the sound and the bulk of them filling the air and the water around the haul-out site. The walrus at rest is not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it is extraordinary. The sheer mass of the animals, the complexity of their social interactions, the sounds they produce, the grunts and bellows, and the bell-like calls of the males that carry for kilometers across the water, all of it creating a sensory experience that is unlike anything else in the Arctic, and that has been described by almost everyone who has encountered it as deeply memorable in ways that are hard to articulate. The walrus haul-out is ancient. The same sites have been used by walruses for thousands of years, the rocks smoothed by the repeated passage of their bodies, the vegetation modified by their presence, the surrounding seafloor depleted of the clams that previous generations have consumed and recovering slowly between periods of use. The haul-out site is the walrus's place, claimed by the history of their use of it, recognized by each generation of animals returning to it as the place where walrus belong. Breathe slowly. The Arctic is in the dark for part of the year, in a way that is absolute, and that has no equivalent in the experience of most people who have not been there. At the North Pole, the sun is below the horizon for 6 months, not rising briefly and setting again, not rising at an angle so low that the day is very short, not rising at all for 6 months, a continuous absence of direct sunlight that produces a prolonged twilight for weeks at either end of the dark season, and a genuine darkness, lit only by stars and moon and aurora, for months in the middle. The Arctic Ocean in the depths of winter is experiencing a darkness that is not like the darkness of a long night. It is a different thing, a permanent condition, a state that the organisms of the Arctic have adapted to and that they do not experience as deprivation, but as the normal condition of half the year. The aurora borealis above the ice. The polar night is not uniformly dark. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, the charged particles from the solar wind interacting with the Earth's magnetic field and producing light in the upper atmosphere, fill the Arctic sky in winter with moving curtains and waves and spirals of green and pink and violet light that illuminate the ice below with a reflected glow that turns the landscape into something that belongs to a different physics than the daytime world. The aurora has no warmth. It produces no ultraviolet radiation. It cannot support photosynthesis, but it is light, and it is spectacular, and it has been filling the Arctic sky on clear winter nights for as long as the Earth has had an atmosphere and a magnetic field, which is to say for billions of years, long before there were eyes to see it, and it is there right now, above the ice, above the dark water, above the polar bear sitting at the breathing hole and the narwhal beneath the ice and the ringed seal in its snow lair, turning the night sky into the most extraordinary display of natural light that the Earth produces. The under-ice community. Below the ice, in the water just beneath the frozen ceiling, there is a community that science has been studying with increasing attention as the technology to observe it has improved. A community of organisms that live in the boundary layer between ice and water, that use the ice surface as a feeding ground, as a refuge from predators, as a nursery, as a navigation tool. The under-ice amphipods, small crustaceans that cling to the underside of the ice and graze on the ice algae that grows there, are the prey of the Arctic cod that swims beneath the ice in the dim, filtered light of the Arctic spring, and the cod are the prey of the ringed seals that dive from the surface to hunt below, and the seals are the prey of the polar bears that wait at the breathing holes above. 4 trophic levels in the space of a few meters, stacked vertically, the whole food web compressed into the narrow zone between the frozen surface and the dark water below it. The under-ice community is visible in a way that deep-sea communities are not, accessible to divers with the right equipment who can descend through a hole in the ice and turn to look upward at the underside of the ice above them, at the complex topography of pressure ridges and ice keels and smooth areas between, at the coloring of the ice algae turning the underside golden in spring, at the amphipods browsing the algae surface in their thousands, at the Arctic cod hovering in the shadow of the ice, at the entire bottom of the top of the world viewed from below, which is an experience that every person who has had it describes as one of the most disorienting and most beautiful experiences the ocean provides. The world inverted, the surface below you, the deep above you, the light coming from what should be the floor and the dark pressing down from what should be the sky, the Greenland shark, Somniosus microcephalus, We have met the Greenland shark before too, in the context of its extraordinary longevity, its 500-year lifespan, its slow drift through the cold, dark water of the Arctic and the North Atlantic at less than 1 kilometer per hour. But the Greenland shark belongs in this conversation about the Arctic Ocean specifically because it is one of the few large predators that is year-round in the deep water of the Arctic basin itself. Not on the ice or at the ice edge or in the marginal seas, but in the deep open water of the central Arctic, in the cold dark water at depth where the temperature is below 0 Celsius and the pressure is enormous and the light is non-existent, and the Greenland shark moves through it all with the same glacial patience it brings to every part of its existence. The Greenland shark's presence in the Arctic at depth means it is one of the few large predators capable of acting on the organisms of the deep Arctic seafloor and the deep water column, removing the dead and the dying and the injured from the system in its slow foraging sweeps through the dark water. It is a scavenger primarily, taking carcasses that fall to the bottom or that drift in the water column, the bodies of seals and whales and fish that die in the Arctic Ocean, and that the Greenland shark finds through the extraordinary sensitivity of its olfactory system, following the chemical trail of decomposition through kilometers of cold water to reach whatever the ocean has discarded. The Greenland shark is the Arctic Ocean's cleanup crew, the organism that deals with the dead, that closes the loop on the material that other organisms have consumed and discarded, returning the carbon and the nutrients locked in a carcass back into the system in a form that other organisms can use. A whale fall in the Arctic becomes a Greenland shark feeding site, sometimes for months, the slow, patient shark returning again and again to the carcass as it decomposes, taking the available tissue until there is nothing left, and then moving on in its slow drift through the dark. The Arctic in change. We cannot talk about the Arctic Ocean tonight without talking about what is happening to it, because what is happening to it is changing it faster than any environment on Earth has ever changed in recorded human history. And the change is visible and measurable and consequential in ways that are not hypothetical, but observed, documented, photographed, and felt by the organisms that live there. The Arctic Ocean is warming. The sea ice is declining. The extent of the ice in summer, the area covered by ice at the annual minimum in September, has declined by more than 40% since satellite measurements began in 1979. The volume of the ice, which accounts for both extent and thickness, has declined by approximately 70%. The multi-year ice, the old ice that has survived multiple summers and that is the thickest and most stable type, has declined from 50% of the Arctic ice cover to approximately 15%. The Arctic that exists today is not the Arctic that the bowhead whale that is alive right now was born into. The ice has retreated substantially in the decades of that whale's life, and the rate of retreat is accelerating. What replaces the ice is open water, and open water in the Arctic absorbs more heat from the sun than ice does, because ice is white and reflective, and open water is dark and absorptive. And the more ice that melts, the more open water there is to absorb heat and melt more ice. It's a feedback loop that climate scientists call the ice albedo feedback, and that is one of the mechanisms that makes the Arctic warm faster than any other region on Earth. The Arctic is warming at 3 to 4 times the global average rate. The change is happening there first and most rapidly, and the organisms that have evolved for the conditions that existed before are confronting the conditions that exist now with the biological tools that the previous conditions produced. And some of those tools are adequate for the new conditions, and some are not. The polar bear's sea ice is shrinking. The bears that hunt from ice must now swim greater distances between ice flows. The bears that traditionally fasted through the ice-free summer and feasted through the winter hunting season now face longer ice-free periods and shorter hunting seasons. The energy budget that millions of years of evolution calibrated for the old seasonal cycle, now running at a deficit in a seasonal cycle that has shifted. The bears are thinner. The females are reproducing less frequently. The cub survival rates in some populations are declining. The population of polar bears is not yet in catastrophic decline, but the trend in some subpopulations is negative, and the projections for the continued loss of summer sea ice over the coming decades are not favorable for a species that hunts from sea ice in ways that no amount of behavioral adaptation can replace. The narwhal's habitat is changing. The winter pack ice that the narwhal requires is thinning and retreating, and the summer aggregation sites that have been stable for generations are now experiencing conditions that have changed enough to alter the availability of the prey species the narwhal depends on. The narwhal has survived Arctic climate variability before, including warmer periods in the past, and it may be capable of adapting to the changes currently occurring, but the rate of change is faster than anything. The geological record of the past several million years shows the narwhal encountering, and whether the biological flexibility of the narwhal is equal to the pace of the current transition is not something that can be determined in advance of the transition. The Arctic Ocean is opening to shipping traffic for the first time in human history, or at least in recorded human history, because the loss of summer sea ice has made it navigable in summer for months that it was previously locked. The Northern Sea Route along the Russian Arctic coast and the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic archipelago are both now open to commercial shipping in summer in a way they were not 30 years ago. The opening creates economic opportunity, shorter shipping routes between Asia and Europe and North America. It also introduces into the Arctic Ocean a level of ship traffic, noise, pollution risk, and potential for invasive species introduction that the ecosystem has never experienced, in an environment that is already stressed by climate change in ways that reduce its resilience to additional pressure. Lie still. The ice is above us, whatever ice remains, and below it the water is circulating in its ancient patterns, the cold surface water, and the warmer Atlantic layer and the deep basin water, the layers that have been stacked in their current configuration for thousands of years, and that are beginning to shift as the heat content of the upper ocean changes and the circulation patterns adjust, and the boundaries between layers move in ways that will alter the distribution of nutrients and the productivity of the whole system in ways we are only beginning to model. The organisms in it are adapting as they can, the ones with the biological flexibility to shift their behavior and their diet and their timing, and struggling as they must, the ones whose adaptations are so specifically tuned to the conditions of the past that they have no response available to the conditions of the present that does not involve loss. And yet, the Arctic Ocean is still the Arctic Ocean. It still freezes in winter, even if less of it freezes and the ice is thinner. It is still cold, even if less cold than it was. The bowhead whale is still in it, pushing through the thinning ice with its massive head. The narwhal is still gathering in the summer bays of northern Greenland with its extraordinary tusk. The ringed seal is still giving birth in its snow lair, though the snow is less reliable, and the lairs are sometimes flooded by early rain that should still be snow. The Greenland shark is still drifting through the deep at 1 kilometer per hour, 500 years old, and unconcerned with the changes happening at the surface far above. The Arctic cod is still forming its enormous schools beneath the ice, sustaining the entire food web of the Arctic, everything from the copepods below to the polar bears above, in the cold, dark, productive water under the frozen ceiling of the world's most extreme ocean. The life is still there, diminished in some places and altered in others and under pressure everywhere, but still there, still turning over in its ancient rhythms, still producing the ice algae and the copepods and the cod and the seals and the whales and the bears that are the Arctic's contribution to the diversity of life on this planet. The deep basin of the Arctic Ocean, below the biological activity of the surface and the ice edge and the continental shelves, below the zone where the Atlantic layer carries its warmth northward and the Pacific water enters through the Bering Strait. In the deepest parts of the Canada Basin and the Eurasian Basin, where the water is more than 4,000 meters deep, there is a world of cold and darkness and extreme stability that science has only recently begun to investigate with the remotely operated vehicles and acoustic instruments that can reach those depths. What has been found in the deep Arctic basin is not nothing. It is not the sterile abyss that the early oceanographers assumed. It is sparse, much sparser than the deep basins of the Atlantic or Pacific, because the isolation of the Arctic basin and the slow circulation of the deep water limit the supply of organic material from the surface, the marine snow of dead organisms and fecal pellets that sustains the deep sea communities of the other oceans. But it is inhabited. The xenophyophories, giant single-celled organisms that build shells of sediment particles, have been found in the deep Arctic. Deep-sea fish, including species previously undescribed by science, have been recorded by the cameras of research submersibles. The eelpout and the snailfish, and the deep-sea isopods and the sea cucumbers that populate the cold, deep floors of the other oceans are present here too, in their cold-adapted Arctic forms, doing what the deep-sea benthos does everywhere, processing the organic material that reaches the bottom and recycling the nutrients it contains back into the slow circulation of the deep water. The cold seeps of the Arctic seafloor, locations where methane and other gases leak from the sediment through faults and fractures in the seafloor, creating at the seafloor surface the same kind of chemosynthetic community that hydrothermal vents create in the warmer oceans, sustained not by the heat of the Earth's interior, but by the chemical energy of the methane, the sulfide metabolizing bacteria forming mats on the sediment surface, and the animals that feed on them, the tube worms and the clams, and the crustaceans that are found at cold seeps and vents across all the ocean basins, here in the Arctic, in their cold-adapted versions, in the dark and the cold and the pressure of the deep Arctic seafloor. The methane seeps of the Arctic are particularly significant in the current climate context because the Arctic seafloor contains enormous deposits of methane hydrates, ice-like compounds in which methane molecules are trapped within a lattice of water molecules under the pressure and cold of the deep seafloor, stable under the current conditions, but potentially destabilizing as the Arctic warms and the bottom water temperature rises, releasing the trapped methane as a gas that bubbles up through the water column to the atmosphere, where it is a potent greenhouse gas, adding to the warming that caused its release in a feedback loop that climate scientists regard as one of the most significant potential amplifiers of Arctic warming. The cold seep communities are, in this context, not merely interesting biological phenomena, but active participants in the chemistry of the atmosphere, the organisms on the seafloor consuming some of the methane before it reaches the surface, but not all of it. The biological filter imperfect and variable, and dependent on the health of the communities that perform it. The bearded seal, Erignathus barbatus, the largest of the Arctic seals, twice the weight of a ringed seal, named for the conspicuous mass of white whiskers that cover the muzzle in a way that gives the animal a vaguely professorial aspect, long, thick vibrissae that are the bearded seal's primary sensory tool for bottom feeding. The bearded seal is a benthic feeder, diving to the seafloor of the shallow Arctic shelves to find the clams and crabs and shrimp and fish that it locates through its vibrissae in the murky, low-visibility water of the seafloor. The vibrissae of the bearded seal are among the most sensitive mechanoreceptors in the pinniped world, able to detect the pressure waves created by a small moving animal in the sediment at close range and to track the wake of a swimming fish for tens of seconds after the fish has passed, the water disturbance persisting long enough for the seal to follow it backward to the source. The bearded seal is reading the water with its whiskers, constructing a tactile map of its immediate environment at a resolution that its eyes, in the murky bottom water, cannot provide. The bearded seal calls. The male bearded seal produces a song in the breeding season that is one of the most extraordinary vocalizations in the Arctic Ocean, a long, descending, wavering trill that can last for more than a minute, that carries for kilometers through the water, that is heard by the Inuit hunters who have lived alongside these seals for thousands of years, and that has been incorporated into the oral traditions of the Arctic peoples as one of the voices of the ice, the sound that the sea makes in spring when the light returns and the seals sing from below. The song of the bearded seal is produced while the seal is swimming slowly beneath the ice, spiraling upward and downward in a loose helix, the trill filling the water around it and traveling outward in all directions, reaching the ears of other males who respond with their own songs, the breeding chorus of the bearded seals creating, in the water below the Arctic ice in spring, a soundscape that is as complex and as seasonally specific as any birdsong dawn chorus on land. The beluga whale in the Arctic. The white whale, the canary of the sea, the most vocal of all the cetaceans. In the Arctic Ocean and the subarctic seas that border it, the beluga gathers in summer in river estuaries and coastal bays, using the warm, shallow water for breeding and calving, and for the molting of the outer skin layer that belugas perform annually, rubbing themselves against the gravel of shallow river deltas to shed the yellowish outer skin and reveal the brilliant white layer beneath. The summer aggregations of belugas in the estuaries of the Canadian Arctic and in the White Sea on the Russian side are among the most studied wildlife aggregations in the world, accessible enough to be visited by researchers and in some cases by tourists. And the study of these aggregations over decades has produced a detailed picture of beluga social life and beluga cognition that is as rich as any in the cetacean literature. The beluga's navigation under ice. The beluga, like the narwhal, moves through the pack ice in winter, maintaining breathing holes navigating between leads, demonstrating an awareness of the ice structure above it that implies a spatial memory for ice features at a resolution we are only beginning to understand. The beluga's echolocation system, the most sophisticated in the cetacean world in terms of the flexibility of the melon that focuses the click beam, is the primary tool of under-ice navigation, the returning echoes of the clicks building a three-dimensional map of the ice topography above and the water below that the beluga navigates through with the assurance of an animal that knows exactly where it is. The beluga does not become lost under ice. It knows where the leads are and where the breathing holes are, and where the ice is thin enough to break through and where it is not. This knowledge is partly learned, accumulated over years of winter under ice living, and partly cultural, transmitted from experienced adults to younger animals in the same estuaries and under the same ice where their mothers and their mothers' mothers learned it before them. The ivory gull, Pagophyla eburnia, not a marine mammal but a bird, and a bird that is so completely part of the Arctic Ocean ecosystem that to talk about what lies beneath the Arctic ice without mentioning the ivory gull would be to leave out one of the essential connections between the ocean and the air. The ivory gull is the most northerly breeding bird in the world, nesting on remote Arctic islands and cliff faces, pure white, smaller than a herring gull, and so committed to the sea ice that it follows the ice edge through the Arctic year, feeding on the fish and invertebrates exposed at the ice edge and on the carrion left by polar bears on the ice surface, the scraps of seal carcasses that the bear has not consumed, the offal of the kill that the ivory gull finds and consumes with the thoroughness of an animal for whom waste is not a concept. The ivory gull is declining. Its population has dropped by more than 80% in Canada since the 1980s, a rate of decline that has placed it on the endangered species list and that correlates with the loss of sea ice that the ivory gull requires for its feeding habitat. The ivory gull is the Arctic Ocean in the air. When the ivory gull disappears from the ice edge, something has changed in the system that made the ivory gull possible. The under-ice soundscape. In winter, beneath the sea ice of the Arctic Ocean, the acoustic environment is different from any other ocean. The ice damps some of the low-frequency noise that travels easily in open water, but it produces its own sounds, the groaning and cracking of the ice as it flexes and fractures, with changes in temperature and pressure and wind, sounds that travel through the water and through the ice itself, and that are part of the acoustic landscape that the animals beneath navigate by and communicate through. The ringed seal's bark echoes off the underside of the ice. The beluga's clicking and whistling fills the under-ice layer with a complexity of sound that has led researchers to compare it to an aviary. The bowhead's calls, the infrasound that carries for hundreds of kilometers, travel through the ice as well as through the water. The Greenland shark's movement through the water produces pressure waves that are detectable by the lateral lines of the fish around it. The under-ice soundscape is not silence. It is a complex acoustic environment that has been the medium of communication and navigation for the organisms of the Arctic Ocean for as long as there has been an Arctic Ocean. The amphipod Gammarus wilkitsky, a small crustacean, a few centimeters long that lives on the underside of Arctic sea ice in concentrations that are in the areas of good ice algae growth, remarkable. The amphipods cling to the ice surface, grazing on the algae, and they are in turn the primary food of the Arctic cod that hover beneath them, and the primary food of the seabirds that dive through the ice-free patches to reach the under-ice layer. The amphipod is not impressive individually. It is small and colorless, and it moves through the world in ways that do not invite the attention that the polar bear or the narwhal commands. But it is the connection, the hinge between the ice algae and everything that eats what the ice algae ultimately feed. The amphipod converts the primary production of the ice into a form that the fish can consume, and the fish convert it into a form that the seals can consume, and the seals convert it into a form that the bears can consume, and the whole magnificent, elaborate, cold architecture of the Arctic food web rests on the tiny crustacean clinging to the underside of the ice and eating the golden algae of the Arctic spring. The Svalbard archipelago, the Norwegian islands in the high Arctic, closer to the North Pole than to the Norwegian mainland, and one of the most studied Arctic ecosystems in the world because of the Norwegian research infrastructure that has been present there for more than a century, and because of the extraordinary diversity of Arctic life that the islands and their surrounding waters support. The waters around Svalbard are where the warm Atlantic water entering the Arctic from the south meets the cold Arctic water moving southward, a thermal boundary that creates the conditions for extraordinary productivity, upwelling nutrients to the surface where the long Arctic summer day allows photosynthesis for 24 hours at a stretch, producing in the brief summer season a bloom of biological productivity that is among the most intense in the world ocean, the basis for the seabird colonies that nest on the cliffs of the Svalbard Islands, in numbers that dwarf most seabird colonies outside the Antarctic, and for the beluga and narwhal and bowhead populations that summer in the waters around the archipelago. The polar night plankton. One of the recent discoveries in Arctic ocean science is that the darkness of the polar winter does not produce the biological shutdown that was assumed. The plankton communities of the Arctic Ocean do not simply cease to exist for 6 months every year while the sun is below the horizon. They continue, at reduced rates, certainly, and in different compositions from the summer communities, but they continue, finding energy sources other than sunlight, relying on chemosynthesis and on the consumption of the organic material that accumulated in the sediment and in the water column during the productive summer. The discovery of a persistent winter plankton community beneath the Arctic ice fundamentally changed the picture of the Arctic as a feast or famine system, with a long famine and a brief feast, replacing it with a picture of a system that is always active, always metabolizing, always producing, even in the darkest months. The organisms have not given up. They have found ways to persist. This is what the Arctic has always done, what its organisms have always done, found ways to persist in conditions that seem, from outside, to offer no basis for persistence. The sound of the bowhead in winter, when the sun is below the horizon and the ice is thick above, and the temperature has dropped to -40 in the air, and the water at the surface is at its freezing point, and the world above the ice is silent and dark and still. In the deep water below, the bowhead sings. The songs that researchers have recorded in the high Arctic in midwinter are among the most complex and most varied cetacean vocalizations ever documented, the bowhead producing new song types in the dark at a rate that implies a creativity and a musical inventiveness that science is still working to understand. The bowhead sings in the dark. It sings in the cold. It sings in the depths of the winter, when the polar night has been continuous for months and the ice above is meters thick, and the world above the ice has been silent for weeks. It sings, and the songs travel through the water and through the ice, and somewhere in the dark, other bowheads hear them, and some of them respond. The Arctic Ocean at the bottom of the year, the winter solstice, the polar night at its deepest, the sun not just below the horizon but well below it. The twilight that briefly colors the southern horizon at midday absent, except at the very edges of the polar region. The central Arctic, in a darkness that is punctuated only by the stars and the moon and the aurora. The ice is at its maximum extent, covering the entire central basin and extending south into the marginal seas in great tongues and lobes of frozen seawater. The temperature of the air above the ice is far below freezing, temperatures that would kill an unprotected human being in minutes. And beneath the ice, in the water, in the dark, life is continuing. The amphipods are in the brine channels of the ice. The ringed seals are beneath the ice at their breathing holes. The bowhead is singing somewhere in the dark. The Greenland shark is drifting through the deep at its fraction of a kilometer per hour. The beluga is navigating under the ice with its echolocation. The narwhal is in the pack ice, maintaining its breathing holes. The Arctic cod are in their schools, in the water column, waiting for the spring that will eventually come. It always comes. The spring always comes. After months of darkness, the sun appears first as a brief reddening of the southern horizon, and then as a thin arc of light, and then it rises above the horizon and sets and rises again, and each day it rises a little higher and stays a little longer, and the light reaches the ice again, and the ice algae stir in the brine channels, and the copepods begin their ascent from depth, and the bloom begins, and the Arctic summer unfolds with the compressed intensity of a system that has 3 months to do what it does, and that has been doing it with extraordinary efficiency for millions of years. The spring, when it comes, is as extraordinary as the winter is extreme. The productivity of the Arctic Ocean in summer, the amount of organic carbon fixed by the algae and the phytoplankton in the brief but intense polar day, is among the highest per unit area of any ocean. The 24-hour sunlight of the Arctic summer drives photosynthesis without interruption. The algae in the ice and the phytoplankton in the water below, producing organic carbon at rates that fuel the entire system, the copepods reproducing in vast numbers, the Arctic cod growing fat on the copepods, the seals and the whales and the seabirds arriving from their southern wintering grounds to feast on the abundance of the brief Arctic summer and to raise their young in the cold, productive waters that the Arctic provides. The briefness of the Arctic summer, 3 months, perhaps 4, before the light begins to fail again and the temperature drops and the ice begins to form again, and the seabirds leave for their southern wintering grounds and the whales depart for warmer seas, and the polar bears wait on the shore for the ice to form so they can hunt again. 3 months to do everything: to breed, to feed, to fatten, to prepare. The urgency of the Arctic summer is a biological fact, encoded in the timing of every species that participates in it, each one calibrated to make maximum use of the window of productivity and then to survive the return of the winter on whatever they have accumulated. The Arctic is not a place where time is wasted. It is a place where the biological clock runs faster than anywhere else on Earth, where the seasons are more extreme, and the transitions more abrupt, and the consequences of being even slightly mistimed more severe. Your body is very still now. The breathing is slow and deep, and the weight of the day has settled through the surface beneath you and gone somewhere below, somewhere toward the cold and the dark. The way the marine snow settles through the water column and falls toward the floor of the ocean where the cold and the dark are permanent. The Arctic is out there, at the top of the world, in the dark and the cold, and the animals are in it, doing what they have always done. The bowhead is singing in the dark water. The ringed seal is breathing through its hole in the ice. The narwhal's tusk is sensing the water. The Greenland shark is drifting through the deep in its 500-year patience. The aurora is moving in the sky above the ice, green and pink and violet, illuminating the frozen surface of the world's most extreme ocean in colors that have been filling the Arctic sky since before any living thing was there to see them. The Arctic is changing, but it is still there. The ice is less than it was, but it is still there. The animals are fewer in some cases, but they are still there. The water beneath the ice is still cold and still dark, and still circulating in its ancient patterns. The surface layer and the Atlantic layer and the deep basin water, each one in its place, each one doing what it has always done. The thermohaline circulation continuing its slow movement around the Arctic basin and out through the gaps to the Atlantic and the Pacific, connecting the Arctic to the rest of the ocean, the way the bloodstream connects the extremities to the heart. The world is very quiet now. The breathing has found the rhythm that belongs to the very late hour, the rhythm that is almost not breathing, so slow and so gentle that it seems less like a function of the body and more like a function of the night itself. The night breathing, the dark breathing, the old cold world breathing in and out with the same patience that the Arctic has always had. The patience of a place that has been extreme for so long that the extremity is no longer a challenge, but a condition. The condition of being at the top of the world, in the cold and the dark, which is what the Arctic has always been and what it will always be. The ice is there, in the dark. above the water, above the animals in the water, above the bowhead singing and the narwhal navigating, and the ringed seal breathing and the Greenland shark drifting, and the Arctic cod schooling, and the amphipods grazing on the golden algae of the frozen ceiling, above all of it, the ice, cold and still and white and silent in the dark of the polar night, covering the ocean the way the sky covers the land, completely, without gap, without seam. And beneath it, the life, always the life. In the cold and the dark and the pressure and the silence, the life that has been there since before the ice, that was there when the Arctic was warm, that survived the cooling and the freezing and the millions of years of polar conditions, and that is still there now, reduced in some places and altered in others, but still there, still turning over in its ancient rhythms, still producing the ice algae and the copepods and the cod and the seals and the whales and the sharks, still sending the bowhead song through the dark water of the Arctic basin to wherever the next bowhead is, waiting to hear it. Sleep now. You are very nearly there. The last thoughts are moving through the mind the way the marine snow moves through the water column, slowly, without direction, drifting toward the quiet that is waiting below. The Arctic is at the top of the world in the dark, and the cold and the ice is above it, and the animals are beneath the ice, and the ancient water is circulating in the dark, and the bowhead is singing somewhere in all of that cold and dark, and singing into the water that carries the song for hundreds of kilometers to whoever can hear it. The ice is there, the dark is there, the cold water is circulating, the bowhead is singing, and you are asleep, in the warmth, in the quiet, in the night that is not polar but that has the same ancient dark at its core. The dark that covers everything when the light is gone, and that holds it all, the Arctic, and the ice, and the animals, and the water, and the singing bowhead, and the drifting Greenland shark, and the ringed seal breathing through its hole in the ice, all of it held in the dark, all of it held in the cold, all of it held in the ancient patience of the world's most extreme ocean. Sleep. The ice covers everything. The dark holds everything. The Arctic is keeping watch. Sleep. The Arctic Ocean's ancient past. Before the ice, before the polar conditions that have defined the Arctic for the past 2.5 million years, the Arctic Ocean was a different place. And the difference is so total that knowing it requires a complete reimagining of what the Arctic is and what it has been. 55 million years ago, at the time of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the warmest sustained period in the Earth's history in the past 65 million years, the Arctic Ocean was warm, subtropical warm. The surface temperature of the Arctic Ocean at that time has been estimated at around 23 degrees Celsius. The Arctic Ocean in the Eocene was as warm as the Mediterranean is today, a subtropical sea in the polar region, covered not by ice, but by the floating mats of a small aquatic fern called a zolla, which bloomed so profusely in the warm, nutrient-rich Arctic water that the bloom consumed enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to have contributed significantly to the cooling that followed the thermal maximum. The Eocene Arctic Ocean was green, covered in floating fern, warm enough to swim in, surrounded by forests rather than tundra. The cooling happened over millions of years, and the ice came gradually. The permanent ice cap of the Arctic not establishing itself until approximately 2.5 million years ago, when the climate crossed a threshold and the Arctic Ocean began to freeze over in winter, and the summer melt no longer removed all the ice before the next winter's freezing began. The multi-year ice beginning to accumulate, the albedo of the ice reflecting more of the incoming solar radiation, the Arctic cooling further, the ice expanding, the feedback loop establishing itself. The organisms that live in the Arctic today are the descendants of the organisms that were there before the ice and that survived the cooling, adapting to the new conditions as they emerged. Over millions of years of selection in increasingly cold and icy conditions, producing the antifreeze proteins of the Arctic cod and the insulating blubber of the ringed seal and the ice-breaking rostrum of the bowhead, all of them responses to the ice that built up slowly around their ancestors over geological time. The muskox connection to the sea. The muskox does not live in the sea. It is a terrestrial animal, a large bovid of the tundra, and it has no direct relationship with the Arctic Ocean. But the muskox is part of the story of the Arctic system because the rivers that drain the tundra where the muskox grazes carry the nutrients of the tundra into the Arctic Ocean in their spring floods, and the productivity of the near-shore Arctic is partly sustained by the organic material and the nutrients that the tundra rivers deliver to the sea. The muskox, grazing on the tundra grasses, consuming and excreting and dying on the land, is contributing through the watershed to the nutrient supply of the ocean. The land and the sea are connected in the Arctic in ways that are more immediate and more explicit than in most parts of the world. Because the watershed is enormous, the rivers are large, and the Arctic Ocean is relatively shallow and small enough that the terrestrial inputs are proportionally significant. The muskox grazes, and the river carries what the muskox leaves behind, and the Arctic Ocean receives it, and the algae use it, and the copepods eat the algae, and the cod eat the copepods, and so on. The muskox connected to the narwhal by the river between them. The formation of sea ice, the physics of it, the moment when the surface of the ocean begins to freeze, is not a simple transition from liquid to solid. It begins with the appearance of frazzle ice, tiny ice crystals that form in the supercooled surface water as the temperature drops below the freezing point of the specific salinity of the water, crystals so small and so numerous that they give the water the appearance of an oily slick, a slight thickening and dulling of the surface that is called grease ice, and that is the first visible sign of freezing. The frazzle crystals accumulate and begin to consolidate, forming disks of slush called pancake ice that grow and bump against each other and gradually merge into a continuous sheet. The sheet thickens from below as more ice forms on the underside, the ice crystals growing downward into the water in columns called ice platelets. And as the sheet thickens, the salt that was dissolved in the seawater is excluded from the ice crystal structure and concentrated into the brine that drains downward through the ice in the brine channels and eventually sinks into the water below. The brine draining making the water beneath more saline and therefore denser, triggering the downwelling of surface water that is one of the mechanisms driving the global thermohaline circulation. The formation of sea ice is therefore not just a physical process happening at the surface of the Arctic Ocean, it is a pump. Every winter, as the Arctic ice forms, it drains brine into the water below and drives the sinking of dense saline water that feeds the deep water formation of the Atlantic, and ultimately powers the conveyor belt of the global ocean circulation, the slow loop of water that connects all the oceans and that distributes heat from the tropics to the poles, and brings nutrients from the deep to the surface in the upwelling zones that are the most biologically productive areas of the ocean. The formation of the Arctic sea ice is connected to the circulation of the entire ocean. The ice is a pump, and the pump is running every winter, draining brine and sinking water, and maintaining the circulation that regulates the climate of the entire planet. When the ice thins and forms later and melts earlier, the pump changes, and the circulation changes, and the distribution of heat and nutrients in the ocean changes, and everything downstream of those changes changes with them. The thick-billed murre, Uria lomvia, a seabird of the high Arctic that spends more time in the water than any other bird except the penguins, diving to depths of more than 200 meters in pursuit of the Arctic cod and the small fish and crustaceans that it feeds on, flying north every spring to the great seabird colonies of the cliffs of the Canadian Arctic and Svalbard and Greenland, where it breeds in dense aggregations of tens of thousands of birds, and wintering in the open water at the ice edge, flying south only as far as the ice forces it, and returning north as soon as the ice retreats in spring. The murre is the Arctic Ocean's aerial predator of the upper water column, the bird that makes the connection between the surface and the 50-meter depth accessible to its diving lungs, the connection between the air above the ocean and the fish below it. Watching a murre dive is watching the transition between mediums in its most compressed form, the bird plunging from the air into the water and continuing downward without pause, converting its forward aerial velocity into downward aquatic momentum, the wings now functioning as flippers, the same feathers that generated lift in the air now generating thrust in the water, the bird using the same anatomy in two completely different physical modes, as fluent in the ocean as in the sky, the midnight sun, the Arctic summer day that never ends. At the summer solstice, Above the Arctic Circle, the sun does not set. It circles the sky in a long, low arc, dipping toward the horizon in the part of its circuit that would in other latitudes be the middle of the night but not reaching it. The lowest point of its arc, still above the horizon, still shining with the golden light of the midnight sun across the ice and the open water and the tundra that surrounds the ocean. The midnight sun is not bright in the way that the noon sun is bright. It is golden and long, and it casts shadows that extend to enormous lengths across the ice, the shadows of the pressure ridges stretching for kilometers in the low-angle light. But it is continuous, and for the organisms of the Arctic, the continuous light of the summer solstice is the signal, the trigger, the biological alarm that says now is the time. The light is here and the temperature is as warm as it will be and the window is open. Do everything you need to do in the time available before the dark returns. The phytoplankton bloom that follows the retreat of the sea ice in spring is one of the largest and most intense biological events in the ocean. As the ice edge retreats northward and the open water is exposed to the increasing sunlight, the phytoplankton in the upper water column receive the light they have been deprived of through the winter, and they bloom, dividing and multiplying at rates that can double the population every day, producing in a matter of weeks concentrations of algae that turn the water green and that are visible from space as large patches of color in the gray Arctic Ocean. The spring bloom of the Arctic is one of the most dramatic biological events visible from orbit, a greening of the ocean that moves northward with the retreating ice edge, the bloom following the light as the light follows the sun, as the sun follows the precession of the Earth's axial tilt through the year. The bloom is the beginning. The copepods rise to eat it. The cod follow the copepods. The seals follow the cod. The whales follow the seals. The seabirds arrive from thousands of kilometers to the south to feed their chicks on the fish that the bloom has made possible. The Arctic summer is the bloom, and the bloom is the light, and the light is the sun, and the sun is returning. Breathe now. Let the returning light of the Arctic spring move through your body the way the light moves through the ice, filtered and diffuse and cold but present, always arriving. The darkness is not permanent. It never has been. The Arctic has its dark and its light, its winter and its summer, its ice and its open water, its silence and its songs. And through all of it, beneath all of it, the water circulates and the organisms persist and the food web turns over and the ancient system maintains itself in the conditions it was given. The cold, the dark, the ice, the brief light, the brief abundance, the long wait, and then again the light and the bloom, and the running of the food web from the ice algae through every trophic level to the polar bear on the ice surface looking across the long Arctic horizon, the walrus on the ice, the ringed seal at the breathing hole, the narwhal in the pack ice, the bowhead pushing through with its enormous head, the ivory gull following the bear to the kill site, the bearded seal singing beneath the ice, the Greenland shark drifting through the dark at depth, the Arctic cod in its antifreeze blood, the amphipod grazing on the golden underside of the ice, the ice algae producing organic carbon in the brine channels, in the cold, in the dark, finding a way to convert the dim filtered light of the Arctic spring into the basis of everything. All of it there, all of it now. In the dark, and the cold, and the ice, and the deep water, and the ancient circulation of the Arctic Ocean. The world's most extreme and most poorly understood and most rapidly changing and most extraordinary body of water. The ocean beneath the ice. The life beneath the ice. The songs in the dark water, and the breathing through the holes in the frozen ceiling, and the long patience of the cold-blooded and the warm-blooded, and the 500-year-old, and the newly hatched, all of them persisting in the conditions they were given, as they have always persisted, as they will persist in the ancient dark and cold that is the Arctic's permanent character, beneath whatever changes the surface brings. The ice is there, the water is there, the life is there, and you are here, in the warmth, in the quiet, in the dark of a night that is not the Arctic night, but that has at its center the same darkness, the same ancient presence of the night that has always been there at the core of the world, holding everything in its cold, quiet patience. Sleep now. The bowhead is singing in the dark water under the ice. The ringed seal is breathing at its hole. The aurora is moving in the sky above. The Greenland shark is drifting through the deep. The Arctic is at the top of the world, and you are very nearly gone into the sleep that is as old as the ice and as deep as the Arctic basin and as still as the water beneath the frozen ceiling of the world's most extreme ocean. Sleep. The ice holds everything. The dark holds everything. The Arctic is there. Sleep. The orca in the Arctic. Orcinus orca, the killer whale, was once rarely encountered in the central Arctic. Its access to the basin limited by the heavy sea ice that covered most of it for most of the year. As the ice has retreated, the orca has expanded its range northward, appearing in waters that have not had orca in living memory, appearing in numbers and in seasons that the indigenous peoples of the Arctic have not seen before. The orca's presence in newly ice-free Arctic water is not simply an ecological curiosity. It is a significant disruption. The narwhal and the beluga and the bowhead that have evolved over millions of years in a high Arctic environment, free of the orca, have not evolved the anti-predator behaviors that would allow them to respond effectively to orca predation. They do not flee from orcas in the coordinated high-speed way that the cetaceans of the orca's traditional range have learned to do. They are naive prey, accessible to the orca in a way that the prey of the temperate and subarctic oceans are not. The orca moving into the high Arctic is moving into a system that has no defenses against it, whose prey animals have no experience of it, whose ecological balance was not calibrated to include it. The change in the ice is bringing the orca north, and the animals that were safe behind the ice are no longer safe. The Arctic halocline. The boundary between the cold, fresh surface layer and the warmer, saltier Atlantic layer beneath is one of the most significant oceanographic features of the Arctic Ocean, and it is maintained by the difference in density between fresh and salt water, the fresher surface water floating on the denser, saltier water below, in a stratification so stable that it persists through the summer, mixing that would, in other oceans, bring the warmer water below to the surface. The halocline is what keeps the Atlantic heat locked at depth, what prevents the warm Atlantic layer from melting the ice from below. But the halocline is weakening as the Arctic freshwater budget changes, as the sea ice melts and adds fresh water to the surface in unprecedented quantities, as the rivers of Siberia and Canada carry more water as the permafrost thaws and the runoff increases. The thickening and strengthening of the fresh surface layer, paradoxically making the halocline less stable in some areas, as the mixing dynamics of the changing system alter the boundaries between water masses. The fate of the halocline, the barrier that has protected the sea ice from the Atlantic heat for millions of years, is one of the most closely watched oceanographic questions in the Arctic. Because if the halocline weakens sufficiently to allow the Atlantic heat to reach the ice base, the rate of ice loss could accelerate dramatically beyond what the surface warming alone would produce. The thick winter darkness of the central Arctic, the darkness that lasts for months and that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth except the Antarctic, is not a void. The stars, when the sky is clear, are brighter in the Arctic than anywhere else on Earth, because the air is so dry and so free of dust and pollution that there is almost nothing to scatter or absorb the starlight before it reaches the eye. The Milky Way is visible in the Arctic winter sky as a continuous bright band, not the faint wash that it appears in the skies above inhabited landscapes, but a defined structure, a river of light across the dome of the sky. The individual stars of the galactic plane distinguishable, and the aurora fills the sky in the winter months with a frequency and an intensity that people who have seen it describe as one of the defining experiences of a human life in the natural world. The moving curtains of light that have inspired the mythologies of every Arctic people, and that continue in the modern era, to inspire the artists and the scientists and the travelers who go north to see them. The lights that the bowhead sees from below the ice as a faint glow through the frozen surface above. The lights that the ringed seal sees from its breathing hole as a shimmer in the cold air. The lights that the Greenland shark 500 meters below the surface does not see at all in the permanent dark of the Arctic deep. The Arctic tern, the bird that experiences more daylight than any other animal on Earth. The tern that breeds in the Arctic in summer and then migrates to the Antarctic to spend another summer there, traveling 40,000 kilometers in each direction in its annual round trip between the poles, spending its entire life in the long days of high-latitude summer, never experiencing a winter by the simple expedient of following the summer from one pole to the other. The Arctic tern is a creature of light, of the long polar days that are the most productive times in the ocean's biological calendar, and it exploits those long days at both ends of the Earth in a migration that is the longest of any animals, and that requires a navigational capability that we understand only partially, the tern somehow finding its way from the high Arctic to the Southern Ocean and back again in a journey that crosses the entire length of the planet twice a year, using some combination of sun compass and magnetic sense and star navigation and memorized landmarks to find the same nesting sites on the same Arctic beaches year after year. The walrus and the vanishing ice. The walrus uses sea ice as a resting platform, hauling out onto floes between foraging dives, the ice providing a surface above the deep water where walrus can rest without swimming to shore, which is often far away. As the summer sea ice retreats from the shallow continental shelves where the walrus feeds, the walrus that traditionally rested on ice above the feeding grounds is forced to swim to shore instead, concentrating in enormous numbers on the beaches of Alaska and Russia, where terrestrial haul-out sites are available. These terrestrial haul-outs, which have been documented with increasing frequency and increasing numbers over the past 2 decades, create conditions that were not historically common. The animals are crowded on beaches in densities that cause stress. When something disturbs the haul-out, polar bears approaching or aircraft passing overhead or unusual sounds, the panic response of thousands of walrus moving simultaneously toward the water creates stampede conditions in which animals are trampled, sometimes hundreds at a time, in a mortality event that would not occur if the animals had the ice platform they evolved to use, and that they are losing to the warming of the Arctic. The belugas of the St. Lawrence, far south of the central Arctic, in the estuary of the St. Lawrence River in Canada, there is a small isolated population of beluga whales that became separated from the main Arctic beluga population thousands of years ago as the ice retreated following the last glaciation, and that has been living in the St. Lawrence ever since, adapting to the conditions of a temperate estuary rather than the Arctic conditions of their relatives. The St. Lawrence belugas are among the most studied cetaceans in the world, accessible to researchers year-round, and the study of them has produced a detailed picture of beluga biology, behavior, cognition, and social life that has informed our understanding of the Arctic belugas, despite the very different conditions in which the St. Lawrence population lives. The St. Lawrence belugas are also among the most contaminated cetaceans in the world. Their tissues loaded with the persistent organic pollutants and heavy metals that the industrialized watershed of the St. Lawrence has been delivering to the estuary for a century, making them a sentinel species for the industrial contamination of the aquatic environment. The St. Lawrence beluga is the Arctic beluga seen through the lens of what industrial civilization does to an isolated population with nowhere to go and no way to escape the water chemistry of its home. Your breathing has settled completely now. The thoughts are very few and very distant, moving at the edge of awareness like the Greenland shark moves at the edge of visibility in the deep water, there and then gone, there and then gone, each one a faint presence that does not require attention and receives none. The Arctic is at the top of the world in the dark, and the ice is there and the water is circulating beneath the ice in its ancient thermohaline patterns, and the animals are in it. The narwhal and the bowhead and the ringed seal and the walrus and the Greenland shark and the Arctic cod and the amphipod and the ice algae, all of them doing what they have always done in the conditions that have always defined their world. The cold and the dark and the ice and the brief light, the long wait and the brief abundance, the singing in the dark and the breathing at the hole and the 500-year drift through the deep. It is all there, right now, at the top of the world, in the ice and the dark and the cold water that has been circulating in the Arctic basin for longer than anyone can meaningfully reckon, in the ancient rhythms of the most extreme ocean on Earth, the water that connected the fish to the seal to the bear, the algae to the copepod to the cod to the narwhal, the ice to the brine channel to the amphipod to the Murray diving from the air. All of it connected, all of it depending, all of it persisting in the ancient dark cold water of the Arctic Ocean. Sleep now. The ice is there. The dark is there. The bowhead is singing. The Arctic is keeping everything. Sleep.